Thank you all for joining us today. We are going to give folks just another minute to get on the webinar, and then we will start. All right, looks like we've hit critical mass here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you today to our Bring Our Neighbors Home webinar on jail decarceration. And we have with us today Jessica Howard, our Racial Justice Campaign Coordinator, Elizabeth Epps, our Smart Justice Organizer. I think I got that wrong, Elizabeth, forgive me. And Rebecca Wallace, our Policy Counsel. And if I got your titles wrong, because we change our titles here a little bit, please correct me. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jessica, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much. Delana, thank you. So welcome everyone. Thank you for spending your afternoon with the ACLU to kick off our webinar series, Bring Our Neighbors Home. Many of you may have heard about the campaign early last year during the start of our 2020 legislative session as a multi-year community-driven campaign to ensure that poverty is not considered a crime. So our Bring Our Neighbors Home campaign has kind of three bold goals to bring pretrial justice to Colorado. The first is, of course, to dramatically increase the number of people who are free during the pretrial process. People should be home when their cases are being resolved. The second is to end wealth-based pretrial incarceration, because no one should be behind bars because they can't afford to pay for their freedom. And the last piece is to, of course, fight racism at every stage in the pretrial system, from arrests to risk assessment to bond revocations. We have to acknowledge that there are racial disparities in our system, and we have to study and eradicate it every step of the way. So today we are going to start this series by addressing the heart of our campaign. How do we accomplish decreasing Colorado's jail population? For our overview, it's always important that we lay the foundation by discussing how we came to be in the situation that we're in now, by giving space to talk about mass incarceration. From there, we'll discuss the ACLU's policy team and their work over the past year to draw attention to decreasing both prison and jail populations due to the COVID outbreak. But of course, which has seen that the jail numbers have seen a dramatic decrease, but now we want to keep those numbers low. So we are turning our focus to this year's legislative session to pass laws that keep the jail populations low and to continue to chip away at the numbers. Afterwards, we'll discuss how you can become involved in the Bring Our Neighbors Home campaign, because we are going to need your help in urging certain legislators to support the legislation that we want to pass. And we're also going to need the community to help educate about the realities of not just mass incarceration, but that the work that we're doing to decarcerate our jails do work. So with that, let's get started with laying our foundation of the problem of mass incarceration. So many of you have joined us in previous webinars during our decarceration work, whether it's our redemption campaign to urge our governor to use his clemency powers, or our Bail 101 sections to address wealth-based detention from our court watch trainings. We talk about mass incarceration a lot, and some of the information that we'll cover today will be a repeat. But I do really want to stress the importance that whenever we come together to talk about the ACLU's work and the actions that we want to take, that we bring intentionality to our conversations by reminding ourselves why we're working to decarcerate our Colorado's correctional facilities to begin with. For me personally, this is a way to practice Sankofa, which is an Akan Ghanaian symbolism that translates to the effect of looking to the past to inform the future. Of course, this term is generally used in context of a reminder of African culture. And of course, mass incarceration is very much part of our present lives, but it is just a reminder that we must look at the history of our actions as we move forward in our efforts to positive change. So that is what we're going to be doing here by discussing the problem of mass incarceration, and particularly within our Colorado jail systems. So for an overview, what is contributing to the mass incarceration problem in Colorado generally? Of course, certainly we can look at factors such as an over-reliance on a punitive system to address our social problems, cops making arrests and using the court system to throw people in cages. And a lot of these contributing factors to mass incarceration are economically driven. You know, if we look at lengthy jail stays before a bond hearing, people commonly are waiting 3 to 10 days in jails to see 10 days to see a judge before their first bond hearing, even though the due process requires that such hearings should be held within 48 hours. We have debtors' prison practices. Basically, it keeps folks who are impoverished in Colorado jails before the trial date, and it's really solely because they don't have the ability to pay the city and county fees that are being ledged against them when they go through the system. The excessive fees, like the county fees and the court fines, again, are extracted from folks who, you know, are having a hard time already meeting their day-to-day needs. And so usually, you know, what we find a lot of times is that it's not only being extracted from the people who are incarcerated, but it's also being taken from their friends and their families, just in order to secure their release. And of course, we see a lot of government inefficiencies that is extending the pretrial incarceration. Many times, and certainly our Smart Justice organizer, Elizabeth, can let us know, some people are often prohibited from posting bond for many hours until the bond is set by court. And then sometimes those who have posted bonds still are remaining in jail for hours at a time, or even sometimes days, still waiting for their release. And of course, we can never forget that, you know, we use incarceration to cage our most vulnerable populations. Folks who are experiencing poverty, our Black and Brown communities, and people who have disabilities and mental health issues. So to set the stage, we can start off by remembering that Colorado has an incarceration rate of 635 per 100,000 people, and that's including our prisons, our jails, immigration detention centers, and juvenile facilities. And this means that we are locking up people at a higher percentage than many people in our than other wealthy democracies. And so, of course, the graphic that you see here may be very familiar to many of you. How are incarceration rates within Colorado being divvied up among our correctional facilities? And as time goes on, these numbers are going to fluctuate, especially because we've yet to fully understand how the impact of the pandemic is having on our incarceration, since we're still kind of in the moment dealing with the issue. But this is what it's sitting at, give or take, around 2018. For the redemption webinar, we focused on the green portion of the pie to address numbers as it relates to state prisons. And today we're going to focus on that orange piece, the local jails. And when we say local jails, we're referencing our county jails and the cities who are large enough to own their own jail, to run their own jails, such as like Aurora. So we look at Colorado's jail profile and we look at this number, 12,000 residents locked up in cages. But to be honest with you, is this really telling the full story? And I don't think it quite is. I think there are a few different lenses that we can look through when we're understanding a jail's impact on the community. So for example, we should also consider some other troubling statistics that was gathered by the Prison Policy Initiative. And that is the number of people impacted by county and city jails in Colorado being a lot larger than what this graph is suggesting because of the revolving door that jails create, where people are cycling through jails at a relatively quick pace. And we call, many folks call this the jail churn, which measures the number of times people are booked into a facility in a year, and kind of, again, seeing that population changing. So according to the Prison Policy Initiative, each year in Colorado, that number is 87,000 different people are booked into our local jails in Colorado. Big difference. So how are we getting 87,000 people being booked into Colorado jails per year? That's because this jail churn is doing some very specific things that we don't necessarily see in prisons. The first is that Colorado jails are detaining people who are not convicted of a crime. In fact, what we see is about 51% of folks who are in our local jails have not been convicted of a crime. They are legally innocent people. The second is that those who have been convicted are generally serving sentences under a year. And in some states, people in jails are being held for federal or state law enforcement agencies. And even the ACLU of Colorado has kind of seen that over the years through our litigation work with some county jails implementing immigration holds. So today we're going to focus again on the economics piece of the mass incarceration puzzle, and that the inability of people unable to buy their freedom out of jails during the pretrial process. So some people within the jail pretrial population will make their bail within hours or days after their first appearance before a judge. But many folks are detained until trial. And, I definitely kind of put an asterisk, on trial because, very few folks actually are able to take their cases all the way to trial, basically for the reason that they can't afford to stay in jail. So they end up taking plea bargains. And again, they're sitting in there because they can't afford to pay the cash bail. So the massive increase of detention that we're seeing was really kind of driven, has kind of driven the jail population since the 1980s, when we're definitely seeing kind of course like that surge of using jails and prisons as a response for punitive reasons. So if we even look among people who are in local jails across the US, who have been convicted, even 3/4 of the sentences are for nonviolent offenses. So let's take a quick look at the graph here. So jail has become, again, this revolving door for our community. So who are these people getting caught in the door? As we found in this report, arrest, release, repeat, from the Prison Policy Initiative in 2019, people who go to county jail and city jails are disproportionately likely to have a substance abuse disorder, suffer from mental health issues, and lack health insurance. We see that folks who are being jailed 3 or more times per year, a disproportionate number are unemployed. So individuals, people who are, incapable of paying for their own release, less likely to have a high school education, which is fraught with its own struggles to maintain a livelihood, and, can also make less than $10,000 per year. And so again, we're kind of seeing those who haven't had any rest in the past 12 months who fit that category, and then kind of frequent utilizers or people, who are end up getting caught in this system, like how that exacerbates. So if you're, a person who, has a bond set above your yearly income of $10,000, and for some folks it's, double or triple the amount, how are you going to get free? For many of us, who consider ourselves middle class sometimes, who live paycheck to paycheck, or one natural disaster or, health crisis or family death that can rock, our economic security. So then imagine being part of a vulnerable group likely to be targeted by the criminal legal system and having to pay 3 times your salary for a nonviolent offense or missing your court date. It's absolutely devastating. So oftentimes states and counties use incarceration to address, kind of the social serious issues that we talked about for public and economic inequality. Even short stints in jail can throw an individual's life out of whack if they're forced to miss work, if they're now isolated from their family and friends, if they're cut off from medication, rehabilitation services, etc. Because let's make no mistake here. Jail facilities are not designed to be service providers, but yet we use jails to do this. Health and social services is usually the very thing that can help many of our neighbors from making contact with the system, but yet we're using the system to address the problems. And of course, from here, like as, jail is on the rise, pretrial detention being, this factor, another kind of look at, how economics kind of play out kind of from a different kind of look. If you have an annual income, that is, above 10,000, you're more likely able to find the means to secure your release. But look at, of course, this was a graphic that Elizabeth kind of brought up in our Bail 101 section of our Court Watch program. Look at what's happening with women. We know that, women tend to be paid less than men. And so what is happening, for women who are making, again, just the amount of money to make ends meet, they're most likely going to be detained. Poverty, has been strongly linked, to our incarceration problem. Again, we have unmet bail, poor offenders unable to afford the bail, they're being held for months at a time. Of course, folks who are poor, the people who are accused that are dealing with poverty are also unlikely to be able to afford their own legal representation. And so again, if you're faced with a choice of trying to fight your case or pleading guilty, whether you do or not, you're more likely going to take that guilty plea. And so again, this prison poverty cycle just continues to feed upon itself in this way. And of course, we wouldn't be remiss, and it doesn't go without saying that racist systems and economic inequality go hand in hand. And so we look at pretrial populations in jail, Black and Hispanic communities are going to be disproportionately represented in the numbers. One of the key issues that we talk about when we are addressing jail depopulation in our Bring Our Neighbors Home campaign is how our work is impacting our communities, because we want to make sure that as jail populations are decreasing, that the number for Black and Brown communities are also decreasing, which hasn't always been the case. And that's always something that we want to try to forever keep in mind as we're doing our work and being more intentional about the way in which our work is impacting our Black and Brown communities. Before we shift gears into discussing what is currently happening with Colorado's jail population, it's really important that we put a name and a face to our work. Who are we doing this for? So I want to share with you one of the many stories that the ACLU has worked on to ensure that the voices of those who are being trapped by this system are being heard. Many of you may have heard about Tuesday Olson in our previous work. So Tuesday was incarcerated at the La Plata County Jail for a $25,000 bond for failing to appear in court for a traffic violation. You know, think of a traffic violation being, you know, could be as, you know, as simple as running, you know, a red light. Bond set at $25,000, which she could not afford to pay. Tuesday, at the time when she was in jail, she knew she needed medical attention because she was experiencing abdominal pain and vaginal bleeding. Instead, jail staff told her to rest, isolated her in a medical cell, and only brought her to a hospital days later, where she found out that she had suffered a miscarriage, kidney failure, and a ruptured fallopian tube. Again, a miscarriage, a kidney failure, and a ruptured fallopian tube, stating that I was being held accountable for not appearing in court and I end up losing my child and my organs. I want to ask you, are those the values that we have as a society, that when someone misses their court appearance, we put their lives at risk? Are we really going to say it's okay that we're going to force a woman to suffer in pain inside of a cage with no medical help for a missed court appearance? That is why we are doing our work. So I believe you are probably as horrified as I was when I heard this story, and even more horrified that all of this is being done with our our tax dollars, and that we are permitting this is the treatment that we're getting for our money. So later we'll discuss a need to fix it. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth, our Smart Justice organizer, to talk to us about what is happening to Colorado's jail population numbers now that we're in a pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. So last year, right, what a year it's been. And as brutal as cages are, right, and as we know that they are, it's been the reality that cages haven't created a public health crisis. They've just really amplified it. And to some folks who didn't know, right, there's been a new light shined on the public health disaster that cages already are. And then there's no silver lining to any of this, right? There's no silver lining to a pandemic. But what we have seen in the past year is that Colorado can decarcerate. We can decarcerate safely. We can bring our neighbors home from jails, and COVID has forced us to see this. So I'm sitting here trying to click as if I'm in control of the screen. Sorry about that, Jess. So COVID-19 jail depopulation, what you're looking at here represents the data representing, right, the peak during the peak of summer 2020. We saw 46% decrease in jail population across the state. And that correlates, right, these numbers are numbers, but they correlate to human lives. So that correlates to 6,000 fewer people who are in jail every day in Colorado, right? So some 20,000 folks who are home and free and living in their communities and families every month. I say that with the caution, as you see in the bottom right corner of the slide, that unfortunately jail populations are rising. But how did we get here, right? How did this happen that we had this depopulation? It was very much a team effort in some ways, right? So during the pandemic, sheriffs, judges, defense counsel, and district attorneys, right? So folks, different areas of state actors work together and ultimately to save lives, honestly, by dramatically reducing the jail population. In 3 months, we saw a decrease that we hadn't seen in almost 30 years. That's significant. The other thing that I'd like to offer about that is, well, of course, it matters that we're bringing folks out safely so that they can be in community. It also represents a modicum of something closer to better health options for the people who, for whatever reason, have to remain in cages, right? So for folks who are serving sentences or other things like that, who can't be released pre-trial, right? Getting folks who can be out gives the opportunity for a safer safer, more rehabilitative environment for folks who stay in. What's as significant as the folks who we were able to bring home is that while this happened, while decarceration was happening out of Colorado cages, it didn't correlate to an increase in crime. And I promise you that that's what they, you know who the they is, but what they said would happen, right? Op-eds in the newspaper and district attorneys and lots of carceral folks who are saying, if you let folks out pretrial, you're going to have these, this universal increase in crime. And it's really not what we saw. This graph or this chart represents the difference between, so for the period in 2019 of April to October, as compared to the same months, April to October of 2020. So April to October of 2019 versus April to October of 2020 is what this represents. So where you see the red being the decrease, the change in jail population, the blue being change in crime. I don't actually know what's going on in Jefferson and Larimer. With Jefferson, I will say I have my real doubts about their reporting, but I can't account for Larimer. What is also important to know, right? Whenever anytime we're talking about crime statistics, right, there's some sort of safeguards in terms of, right, it's already building in what are we considering crime, what's on the increase. But here we're talking about, even if we set aside my objections to how they quantify or measure what is crime, even based on those statistics, you see in huge jurisdictions like El Paso and Denver, that even based on their own reporting, not only did crime not go up, but there were places where it went down. There's just a lack of correlation between crime rates and depopulation, and that's reflected in national trends as well. That's a way that Colorado is not unique. A national ACLU study found that the reduction in jail population was just functionally unrelated to crime trends, period. It's worth noting, y'all, though, that any uptick in crime that one might point to, maybe in Larimer, I don't know, but in other places, what we know is that that's reasonably attributed to factors that aren't people being free from cages, but that are the other complicated, multifaceted, right, social factors that are destabilizing communities. There is a pandemic going on, right? And so with that comes economic shutdowns, job losses, right? Stresses, school closures, right? Families in more confined spaces. The extreme wealth gap is growing even more. And of course, the unrest over police brutality and corresponding social justice issues. So said all that to say that that certain offenses that may in some places have been more prevalent or more frequent, those aren't things you can attribute to our neighbors being free from jail. Those are things that make sense because we're going through a pandemic and other societal injustices. It's also not the people who are being released who are, responsible for the crime. Why maintain jail depopulation? Right, there's a few good reasons, but sort of at the top of the list would be, first is to just roll back these harms of pretrial detention. Jess covered it really well, right? Pretrial detention harms people, harms families, harms communities. And so maintaining the decarceral efforts maintains those gains. We need people in their homes, and we need people back at work if they're able to work, and taking care of their children and things that can't be done. It goes right along with that having our folks free builds stronger communities and families. At the Freedom Fund, we're posting bond for someone tomorrow who is at risk of losing custody of a child who, over a very, very minor set of allegations, right? That because he's going to be able to be home, he can take care of his child, and it's a very common scenario. Before COVID, some 12,000 Coloradans spent every night in a cage here, denied the opportunity to work and care for their children. And we want to maintain the jail depopulation so we don't go back to that. And then, of course, saving money. Right? This is often uncomfortable for me to talk about in some ways because, if it's something that brings along folks who might not otherwise be inclined to agree with us, then I'm all for it. But the bigger reason why it's important to acknowledge, to me anyway, why we acknowledge saving the taxpayer money is because it allows us to reallocate, right, resources in ways that matter more to community. On average, right, if now we're looking at some 4,700 fewer people in jail each day compared to before the pandemic, and right, it just sort of the crude numbers, if you extrapolate that at a cost of little less than $100 per person per day, that's saving, $500,000 per day or $170 million per year. And I think that's significant. And Sheriff Joe Pele agrees here. Hopefully you can see that. But what Sheriff Pele said was, we've seen jail populations fall across the state and the sky's not falling. We are reserving jail beds for those who absolutely should be off the street, but we're erring on the side of letting others stay home with their families, aren't using our jail facilities to manage homelessness and drug addiction, which often compounds the problem. Sheriffs across the state, regardless of political leanings, are finding smart ways to safely reduce their jail populations. And many of us see that we can have big reductions in jail populations and keep people safe at the same time. That's good for all Coloradans. I agree with him on that. I hope you do as well. And I particularly want to highlight the sort of end of that second half of the first paragraph, right? This idea that we aren't using our jail facilities to manage homelessness and drug addiction, that shouldn't be something that's pandemic specific. So when we're asking, why do we maintain jail depopulation? It's because we know that jails were never the appropriate place to help our neighbors who are struggling with addiction. They were never the right place to address homelessness. And this has amplified that and made it even more clear. And so that's why we're working to maintain these gains and to double down on them. And I'm handing it over to my colleague, Rebecca Wallace, who is many things, but is going to lead us through a couple of the bills that are going to help us maintain the jail depopulation gains and increase them.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for walking us through the meaningful reforms that have happened over the last, during the terrible times of COVID, the one place that we've seen a little small bright light. And so one of the things that we have done as we've started seeing the jail populations go down is we have been investigating why did they go down and what can we do to keep them down. And so we wrote a report, which I put in the Q&A that reflected our findings. And those findings included, it was actually pretty remarkable to really see the sheriffs step up and say they want safe facilities, and safe facilities meant dramatically fewer people, and really working with district attorneys and judges and public defenders to safely bring those jail populations down. And we found that there were a few key principles that led to the depopulation that could be codified into statute. And we reached out to sheriffs to get a lot of feedback from them on that. We reached out to folks in community, and now we have legislators who have brought legislation that was introduced on day one of the session, which was this past Monday, to preserve some of the reforms. And the next slide will go over, I'll review some of the specific provisions. So the bill that was introduced is Senate Bill 2162, Jail Population Management Bill. The bill sponsors you'll see are Senator Pete Lee and Representative Adrian Benavides. It's going to start in the Senate, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw it in the committee for its first hearing next week or very soon thereafter. And there's really three pillars to the bill. The first one is empowering sheriffs to continue to manage their jails. So what we saw through this crisis is sheriffs actually adopted jail admission standards that said, we are just not going to take low-level folks into this jail. We are not going to take folks who are here because they've been sleeping on a park bench or shoplifting low-level amounts of from Walmart. We are not going to take people into jail because they missed a court case or they didn't show up for a urine analysis, but nobody's been injured. We are going to reserve, as Elizabeth mentioned, our jail beds for people who pose a physical safety threat to others, which frankly is what we believe should have always been what jail beds were reserved for. And there was a sense that this was sort of like an emergency measure and a question about whether sheriffs could continue to impose these kinds of restrictions on jail admissions. And this bill memorializes in statute the authority of sheriffs who want to do this reform-minded work to continue to do so. The other two pieces are more mandatory. And there I'm going to actually go with point 3 first, which is first, we're going to increase the use of summons in lieu of arrest. And what that means is for lower level offenses, especially non-victim offenses, those folks are going to get a ticket that tells them when to come to court. And they are not going to get arrested and taken into jail. For folks who may have had a victim or some of the more serious offenses, there's going to be encouragement for police officers to really exercise good discretion in the street. And that if somebody poses an immediate public safety risk to someone else, go ahead and arrest them and bring them in. But if the immediate threat has passed and that person can be ticketed, especially we can think about for some of the low level felonies and the drug cases that we're still seeing as low level felonies, those individuals can be ticketed and then they're expected to return to court. So there's this increase in the summons in lieu of arrest. That would be one of the big pillars. And then the second big pillar is for those folks who do end up in jail to increase the use of personal recognizance bonds. Those are non-monetary bonds, right? So if you have a personal recognizance bond, you're not going to be stuck in jail because you couldn't afford to pay your way out. And this has been a reform that folks have been looking for in Colorado for many years. And frankly, on all sides of the criminal legal system, there is some movement to work towards more personal recognizance bonds and to move away from the money bond system. A few years ago, we championed a bill that said no money bond for low level offenses like petty offenses and some homelessness offenses. This ups the ante a bit and says, that basically judges, when they're making a decision about whether to issue monetary bond, should only ever issue them when there is a safety threat to another person or the evidence that the defendant is likely to flee. And besides that, they should not just be having folks stuck in jail, for instance, because the court is upset with them that they missed one of their court dates. And so those are like the three pillars. We don't think that it's going to maintain this great 46% decrease in jail admissions that we saw over at the peak of the pandemic and the peak of depopulation. But we do believe it's going to have a substantial impact and bring a lot of our neighbors home who won't no longer be sleeping behind bars at night for these lower level offenses or for offenses where they really are not posing a risk to anyone. So look for that bill, and we would love to see a lot of community support and involvement and engagement on it. And I think there'll be an opportunity later in this discussion where you'll find out how to let us know that you want to be engaged on it. And then there's a second bill that's on the next slide right here, the 48-hour hearing bill. That is not sexy, but it's really important. And it is the third time that the ACLU has championed this bill with Senator Lee has run it before and Rep. Gonzalez-Gutierrez has run it before. We have a few more new faces on the bill now, which is Rep. Stephen Woodrow and Senator Robert Rodriguez. Though they're championing this bill, we expect it to likely be introduced next week. And a 48-hour bond hearing bill basically says that if you are arrested and you are held and you are waiting to have your bond set, you will get to see a judge and have your bond set within 48 hours of arrest. Why is this important? Well, first of all, it's important because just from a purely legal perspective, there is case law that tells us that people must be brought before a judge within 48 hours of arrest. This hasn't gone up to the Supreme Court. It hasn't been dealt with fully in Colorado. But we think that it's a constitutional mandate. But of course, much more even important than that is like the human toll. Jessica spent a good deal of time talking about the harms of pretrial incarceration. Even a few days can change a life. And what we see here in Colorado is that people who are arrested on a Friday are often not seen by a judge until Monday or Tuesday. And by that time on Tuesday, they may well have lost their job or temporary custody of their children. And then we have an even bigger problem for a person like Michael Bailey, who's pictured here, for folks who are arrested out of county, which means like they're arrested on a warrant in one jurisdiction for an issue out of another jurisdiction. And oftentimes these are domestic violence arrest warrants that are no bond hold. And I know a lot of people have fear when they hear domestic violence, but I can promise you that many of these are low-level offenses, they're property offenses. There's not, it doesn't always mean that there's an immediate safety risk. But what happens is these individuals can be held for like 10, 14 days waiting for a, they can be just waiting to be transferred to the other jurisdiction. And actually in Michael Bailey's case, he waited 52 days before he saw a judge. And the moment he appeared before a judge to get his bond set, he was released on a PR bond and his case was shortly dismissed thereafter. And I want to tell you, Michael Bailey is not an anomaly. The length of time, the 52 days, is a particularly long time. But the issue of folks languishing in jail, waiting to see a judge, and then seeing the judge getting released on a PR bond and getting their case dismissed, that happens commonly. So the solution is to require bond hearings within 48 hours of arrest. So that is this hearing. This bill is coming back this year, and we expect it to be introduced next week. Like I said, it's not a sexy bill, but it's an important one. And one last piece I'll leave you with is, we talked about the problems it'd be solving in this moment. It's a really important preliminary step to ending cash bond for folks on this call who are really motivated by that, which, we are one of them. We very much want to end cash bond in this state. But right now, if someone proposed a bill that said no more cash bond, we would have to oppose it. And why is that? Well, because when you end right now, most people who get out of jail get out by paying their bond or having a bonds person post their bond. There's plenty of people who are stuck in jail because they can't pay, but most people get out by paying their bond before they've even seen a judge. So what happens if we end cash bond? When you end cash bond, everyone who's arrested is held on a no bond hold until they see a judge. So if you have a system where people are commonly waiting 5 days to see a judge or 4 days over a weekend, for people who are once bonding out, you are going to actually blow up the jail population and have a whole lot bigger problem on your hand, and of course, harm more lives. So a prerequisite to any meaningful cash bond reform is prompt bond appearances before a judge. And that's why we have focused so heavily on what appears to be this very unsexy issue, and why we hope you will care about 48-hour bond hearings, because we need them if we're going to end cash bond in this state. That's it for me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rebecca. So great. Now that, we've heard from Elizabeth to hear about how our jail populations are decreasing and wanting to keep those low, and Rebecca, really kind of giving us the good overview about what the bills that we are pushing towards to tackle the issue of jail for this legislative session. We always come to the end in terms of what is our call to action for you guys. So, we have this campaign. And again, as I had mentioned before, earlier on, that, this not only includes our jails, but it includes our immigration detention centers and our juvenile detention centers. But at the end of the day, it's all about trying to decrease the numbers that we see in our jail populations. But, basically the ask is simple. We really need your help, with this campaign. And there are a variety of things that, folks can do to get involved, of course, because these are legislative bills, of course, that means that we are going to need to contact our legislators. Perhaps that may be, encouraging and giving support to the legislators who are sponsors or who are supporting this bill, to let them know that the community is behind them and believes that this is what we want for our systems going forward. It could also be urging legislators to, to come to our side. So of course, that's always kind of, the big thing. And that can, again, go either sending emails or making phone calls. Of course, we will be having our big lobby day in April, where we're going to be working, to talk with our legislators about these issues. For folks who like to do a little bit more behind the scenes, I'm not one of these people in terms of, going to social media, but if social media is really your thing, then, we want to start creating toolkits in order for you to not only, again, contact the senator, but to also be an educator for your community about, the issues of mass incarceration. This can also turn into, for folks who really like to write, to help us write letters to the editors, to local newspapers, to debunk crime myths. Because again, why are we here? In the first place is because we were believing, decades before, that a punitive system was going to be the problem solver for crime, and it just isn't. But yet we know that so many people still believe that. And so again, it takes education to continue to really get folks to understand why, decreasing our jails is the way to go. So if you are interested, and it's great, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the link into our chat. Basically, this is a survey for folks to kind of go in and just kind of express, what is your interest? Where are you, hailing from? What Colorado city are you hailing from? What issues are you interested in? Jail, decarceration. Again, this is a webinar series, so we are going to talk about other aspects of the carceral state, including, our immigration system, our juvenile system, and of course, as you kind of saw from the story I shared about Tuesday Olson, how do we protect people's reproductive rights within jails as well. So yeah, let us know what you're interested in, what you're passionate about, how you want to take action. So then that way we are very intentional with you to kind of get you set where you want to go, whether again, it's joining a phone bank or a text bank, talking to your legislator. We have a lot of plans to really kind of get our members and our supporters involved with that. One of the slides I totally forgot to add is, of course, again, this is a 4-part series, so we will be resuming this series in 2 weeks. So on March 2nd, we will be doing a webinar with our immigration campaign coordinator, Amatamu Ading, and also our volunteer and field organizer, Julian Camera, to talk about immigration and some of the work that we can do there to decrease numbers in those facilities. So definitely, again, sign up, let us know how you want to get involved, because we have a lot of work to do. The first bill on the management bill has just been introduced. The legislative session started this week, but we're going to be hitting the ground running, and we want to take you with us. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm sure there's probably quite a few questions, probably particularly for Elizabeth and Rebecca, concerning the bills that we're passing. But again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to kick off this webinar series.
Hey, Jess, can you post that link in the chat again? I think it just went to the panelists this time.
Oh, it did.
Yeah.
Sure did. Yes.
Thank you.
I get that.
And is it okay if I just answer one of the questions that I've seen,
Absolutely.
Jessica? So
Yeah.
one of the questions that I see is about the 48-hour bill, rural jurisdictions who are underfunded and don't have enough judges who necessarily could work throughout the weekend, and also the issue of the fiscal impact. So let me just say that, and why this bill hasn't passed previously. The very first year this bill was introduced, we did strip this provision out, other provisions passed, because we had so much pushback specifically from rural jurisdictions, and that this was just going to be so costly for them. So we took some time to work with those jurisdictions and think through, how do we correct, how can we make this more workable for them? And also, like, we kept suing, and we frankly may be suing again on this issue, and it was costing the counties a lot of money. So there's a reason to start thinking about, okay, how can we make this work for everybody? You can't sue your way out of this problem. And what we ended up doing was working with judicial and some rural jurisdictions to create a statewide bond commissioner, which would be a state paid FTE, or a full-time equivalent, a state paid position that would be available to rural jurisdictions, where the judge could set bond virtually on the weekend. and it would cost nothing to those jurisdictions that chose to participate in it. And it would ensure that those jurisdictions, that there was no need to open up their courthouses, so the sheriffs weren't going to have to transport people who are incarcerated and weren't going to have to provide security. And I think through COVID, there's really been a steep positive learning curve where folks were really concerned about, could they manage these virtual appearances? And of course, it is always better to appear in person, but on the week, we would rather get people before a judge promptly than wait 5 days for that in-person appearance. And I think during COVID, everyone in the system, and I mean, me at the ACLU, we've all learned how feasible it is to do a lot more virtually than we anticipated. So I'll just say, before COVID, our bill died last year. With most bills, it died on the vine on the calendar because the session ended. This year it's back. And I think in a lot of ways, it's a stronger bill than ever, because sheriffs and counties really believe they can do these virtual court appearances. And that's because they are doing them, that they're cost effective. They're not, there was a sense that this was going to be hugely expensive, but it turns out you just need a laptop and WebEx. And so the fiscal note, Megan, you asked about the cost to the state, it's not overwhelming at all. It's about $500,000. I know that sounds like a lot of money, but for a bill like this, that's going to have statewide implications, it's a really reasonable fiscal cost. So I think that covers the question.
Great. Any others you see there, Rebecca, that you want to answer?
I think the other questions are, about whether we can send a link for a social media toolkit, and whether there'll be a recording of this.
Yeah, we're going to post this later on today on the website, so it will be available for others to watch. And Jess, do we have
the social media toolkit? Now that we have the folks who have attended, it's definitely something we can send to you, and as well as if you put it in the survey as well that you're like really interested in that, then we can also find even more fine-tuned ways for you to reach out on social media. So yes, definitely be on the lookout for that.
There were also several questions during the presentation on the national incarceration data about, like, is there more up-to-date data? Is there more Colorado-specific data? I did put a link in the chat to the state dashboard on jail populations, which includes breakdowns by race, ethnicity, pretrial, gender, and age. And that extends from a bill that the ACLU championed in 2019, because this information was unavailable. It was almost impossible without doing a 6-month open records request study, which we did, to understand who was in our jail and why. And so we championed a jail data collection bill that Representative Weissman ran, and actually I think was nearly unanimous support. So the data is, I think it's a pretty user-friendly website, and I can actually put it in the chat too. But over time, we'll work on incorporating some of the data in there into our presentation. Needless to say, the racial disparity is highly prevalent, especially for Black people in Colorado. They're overrepresented by over 3 times their rates in the population, both at the pretrial and sentenced. And that's true, frankly, at every stage of our criminal legal system. So folks might find that interesting.
Thank you for adding that to the chat, Rebecca.
Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, we can go ahead, I guess, and wrap it up for today, give people a few minutes back in their lives, and join us for our next Bring Our Neighbors Home webinar, which is when, Jess?
It will be Tuesday, March 2nd at noon. We can definitely, again, send out, actually, if I can find the link, I could try to put that in the chat as well. Sorry, I meant to make that slide. Here we go. Stop the share, get into our chat, and there we go. In the chat should be the link to sign up for our next webinar.
And of course, we will send out a follow-up to this, and the links will be in there too. So if we don't have any other questions, we're going to close it off for today. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.